Welcome to Loyola University New Orleans for this event. And I'm going to just give a short welcome, and then we're going to launch right into it. No 10-minute intro. And my name is Craig Hood. I'm director of our interdisciplinary environment program, undergraduate program here at Loyola. I'm also a faculty member in the biology department. Our program is just 5 years old, and we've gone from 0 to 80 students in 5 years, which I think is pretty good. We have undergraduate environmental studies and environmental science degrees. And we also host events like this one and a regular series we call Environmental Roundtables, and I just invite you to follow our website, the Loyola website, but also our Facebook page for all of our events. Of course, we're hosting this, but we have some other partners. So I'm going to ask Justin Nystrom to stand up so you can see him. He's director of the Center for the Study of New Orleans here. And they're our co-sponsor. And also a week ago in this very room, we had a mayoral forum that Justin helped sponsor, and it was a terrific event that tried to drill down on especially issues concerning city life, especially transportation and also zoning, etc. They have a website that includes Crescent City Connections, and the Center for the Study of New Orleans has sort of a motto or a statement that what we're seeking to do, and it's very appropriate to this tonight, is asking critical questions for a vital city. And at least all of us here in New Orleans believe this is a vital city. Also, we have a media, really not sponsor, but partner in WWNO Radio. And I'll ask Tegan Wiglin to raise her hand back there. As many of you probably know, she hosts the Coastal Desk that does all sorts of programs on the coastal situations here in New Orleans. So, yes, thanks. And so, let me introduce here now, just very quickly, Dr. Eric Hardy, who is an environmental historian, and he's in our environment program, but also the Department of History. He received his PhD from Georgia Tech University in an interdisciplinary PhD program on society and technology, and his dissertation was very appropriate for tonight's topic as well. It was essentially writing and documenting the social, economic, and environmental technological history of the development over the last 70 years of the water system in the city of Atlanta. So, with no further ado, I'll introduce Eric, who will get us started, and we'll have a Q&A after having questions and interactions. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig, and welcome everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to offer my condolences to the family of Mr. Bill Borah. I did not know him, but as a resident of uptown New Orleans, I can certainly appreciate not having a 6-lane highway running through there and the cityscape in the French Quarter. And in a shameless plug for a class I will teach next semester on the urban environment, we will be reading about Mr. Bob Moses and people like Mr. Borah and other activists who helped shape the urban landscape. Okay, so to the matter at hand, I'm Eric Hardy, and as Dr. Hood was describing, I have a degree in the history and sociology of technology and science. I wrote a dissertation, which became the basis of a book I'm completing, and it was on the difficulty of managing water, land, problems of these practices in post-war American cities. I use Atlanta as what I believe to be an illustrative example of these difficulties. So it was with great interest that I looked upon the Sewage and Water Board in the August 5th flooding. And I sat back for a week and observed, and I penned an op-ed, local newspaper. And the morning it ran, I got an email from Mr. Quatrevo, the Inspector General of the City of New Orleans. He thanked me for writing, made some references to other deficiencies in infrastructure around the country, and then pointed out a list of reports that his city had conducted on the Sewage and Water Board. Some I was familiar with, others not. But one that caught my attention was on potential exposure to lead in the water delivery system. And I said, hey, here's a chance for Loyola to perhaps offer a platform for Mr. Q to address this issue. And from there, through conversations with colleagues, decided to expand it. I talked to Mr. Quatrevo. He agreed to come. But then I also thought, well, let's bring in some other folks. David Wagner, who many of you may know, sort of the the brains behind the urban water plan, concept of living with water here in the city, and ways of reducing our reliance on the drainage system with the Sewage and Water Board. Also, Rob Verchek, professor at Loyola's Law School, who just wrote or helped co-write an amicus brief on behalf of the Levee Board and their suit against 80-some-odd oil and gas companies. And I spoke with Tegan, and from that point, reached out to the mayor's office. And he initially put forward Mr. Jeff Hebert. Unfortunately, Mr. Hebert couldn't make it. And he's offered up Taylor Anthrop in his place. Similarly, Mr. Quatrevo, as some of you may know, has fallen ill. And he has asked Ms. Nadine Van Dyke to come in his place. So these are the folks we've assembled. And my idea for tonight is to have a conversation about the challenges to comprehensive water management in New Orleans and the metropolitan area. This is not a campaign, but I want to have a discussion, a frank discussion. And so what I'll do now is to introduce folks one by one, have them speak for a few minutes about their approach to this topic, and then from there we can begin the discussion. So I'd like to begin with Ms. Van Dyke. She served as the New Orleans Office of Inspector General's Assistant Inspector General for Government Performance for more than 5 years. At the OIG, Ms. Van Dyke has supervised projects ranging from the evaluations of police staffing and deployment, to the city's risk management programs, to the city's procurement policies and procedures. Ms. Van Dyke has co-authored the OIG's Lead Exposure and Infrastructure Reconstruction Project and is currently supervising the OIG's forthcoming report on the Sewage and Water Board's water quality testing procedures under the lead and copper rule. I'd like to welcome Ms. Van Dyke.
Thank you. Good evening. I want to make it clear initially that I am not an expert in water management. However, I'm really happy to be here tonight to share what the OIG has learned about the Sewage and Water Board in the 5 years it's been a focus of the office. To start things off, I'd like to ask everyone a couple of questions. By a show of hands, prior to the news about the recent pump failures, how many of you present here have ever watched a video of a Sewage and Water Board meeting? They're available on the Sewage and Water Board's website. Excellent. Anyone else? Okay, next question. How many of you can name 2 or more Sewage and Water Board members? A few of you. I asked these 2 questions because I want to make the following point. There's an inherent drawback to boards and commissions that govern public entities and have authority over public funds. They are virtually invisible to citizens and therefore largely unaccountable for their actions. When Bob Sarasoli came to New Orleans after being appointed the first New Orleans IG, he was astounded at the number of boards and commissions and made it his priority to provide oversight of them and to bring to light the amount of money, the authority they controlled. There are 2 things that set the Sewage and Water Board apart from most boards and explain why the OIG has focused on the Sewerage and Water Board for the past several years. First, its size. The Sewerage and Water Board employs about 1,000 people and its operating budget is huge, approximately 1/3 of the city's general fund. And its 2017 capital budget is almost $500 million. The second reason that sets the Sewerage and Water Board apart from other boards is its mission, and that is to provide safe drinking water and adequate drainage and sewerage operations to everyone in New Orleans. To a greater degree than is true for many other boards, the performance of the Sewerage and Water Board's mission is essential to both the safety and the health of every New Orleanian. The OIG has been providing the public with reports on the Sewerage and Water Board's shortcomings since 2012, when Inspector General Quatrefoes stated in a public letter that it was the most likely of the city's component entities to engage in fraud, waste, and abuse. Just to give you a couple of examples. The 2013 OIG audit found that the Sewerage and Water Board failed to collect $8.5 million in sanitation fees and could not produce billing records for 6 months of the audited period. That same year, the OIG found that the Sewerage and Water Board paid $4.5 million in costly overtime and standby pay in violation of civil service rules. Employees whose base salaries averaged from $40,000 to $50,000 a year earned an additional $60,000 to $70,000 a year in overtime and standby pay. Sewerage and Water Board managers admitted they did not have adequate controls over standby and overtime and acknowledged that crew sizes were potentially overstaffed. When they examined 3 months of 2014 accounts receivables, OIG auditors found almost 1/2 of accounts payable totaling $10.3 million, more than 90 days past due. And due to a decades-old computer system, the sewage and water employees could not tell auditors which customers' bills were delinquent or for how long they had been delinquent. These problems stemmed in part from both a high tolerance for antiquated and ineffective financial record-keeping systems and to managerial complacency, evidenced by a dearth of written policies governing procedures. More recent OIG reports related to the Sewerage and Water Board indicated that poor performance was not limited to finances. For example, in December 2016, OIG investigators announced the results of an investigation into the Sewerage and Water Board employees' theft of brass. More than 35,000 pounds of brass was sold to scrap yards at a loss to the Sewerage and Water Board of more than $500 million. How could such a protracted scheme go unnoticed? Because the Sewerage and Water Board had virtually no controls on inventory, warehousing, and property procurement. It simply failed to secure its stock. The OIG will also soon be releasing an evaluation of the Sewerage and Water Board's water quality testing practices under the lead and copper rule, which is the federal regulation that limits the allowable concentration of lead and copper in drinking water at the tap. While working on that project, evaluators discovered another issue: the potential for increased lead exposure due to the massive amount of infrastructure reconstruction work recently begun in the city. In his recent public letter, the Inspector General summed up his appraisal of the Sewerage and Water Board in this way, quote, "The fundamental problem with the Sewerage and Water Board is that it is an institution impervious to change. Its independence permitted decades of technological progress to bypass the Sewerage and Water Board." The Inspector General further observed that whenever the Sewerage and Water Board did not have the funds to perpetuate its ineffective and inefficient practices, instead of modernizing and finding ways to reduce costs, it sought rate and millage increases. He concluded that, quote, "The problem is structural. The Sewerage and Water Board must be replaced with a modern organizational structure, one that makes elected officials responsible for the organization's performance." Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Van Dyke. To her right, we have David Wagner, president of Wagner and Ball, an award-winning, internationally active architecture and planning practice located in New Orleans. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Mr. Wagner saw an opportunity for New Orleans to reinvent itself as a sustainable city that embraces its lifeblood, water. To that end, he has championed a process that examines history, soils, biodiversity, infrastructure networks, urban space, along with the forces of water. This combination serves as a foundation for design, first developed during the Dutch dialogues and continuing through the Greater New Orleans Water Plan. I'd like to welcome Mr. David Wagner.
It's on. Thanks, Eric and Loyola. I think to begin the discussion, I don't know that the water board, I think the question is to do what? I hear that it's behind in technology, and I'm a child of the 60s, and we used to believe in technology, but it has its limits. Maybe I can advance this. No, I can't. I was in Japan recently. I may take a couple more minutes. In Japan recently, and in these rice fields, which are adjacent to it, which have a temple with them. In Bali and in Asia, the water temples are the monitors of the ecological health, and they know when to let the water in and when not. But if I look at this and see the condition of the earth here on that island, and I think about what the condition of our earth here is here in South Louisiana, this picture from Pointe-aux-Chenes, and you look at what's really happening with the coast to set the context for the city. These are the same graphics you've really mostly been seeing, but you've been seeing them with red where water is, and you see what it was and what it is, and then you see what it's going to be with no action, and you see what's happening and how close you're getting to open water. And even with the Coastal Master Plan, the great thing that's going to save us from the bigger sea, and with the money, it's still a limited palliative. I should go back. That was a mistake. It's a little difficult. And then you have the flood that comes across that, and Baton Rouge isn't so safe either with the storm surge. Damn. Sorry. Am I supposed to curse at Loyola? Or maybe it's okay. I don't know. But we are, and the water plan's work has really been about, and this discussion is about the city of New Orleans. To do what is the question of to pump all the water out. The politician's mantra was we have to pump out every drop of water that falls here, which is folly and impossible. If you double the capacity of the drainage system, the calculations we have say that you would fix 40% of the problem. So let's think about that and what the investment would be to do what again. Because all you get is more pipes and pumps, and I don't think that's probably the preferred neighbor. We in the water plan conceived of the area as a really an open landscape. This is the living with water concept that we branded or trademarked or whatever we tried to do with it to get people to understand, is to say that water is not only inevitable but beneficial. And so if you look at the canals in Jefferson, or you look at the opportunity along the outfall canals, or you look at the conditions in all sorts of places, you can add water and improve benefit. Audubon Park has lagoons, City Park can do more. But we have these residual conditions after the flood, after the pump stations are moved to the edge. You have these residual conditions, and these conditions give us opportunities, if we know what we're doing, to operate a water system in the city. And this is to do what? Because to do what is more than pump it out. It's actually to take advantage and live alongside it. Why is the real estate section always advertising property alongside water? And yet in New Orleans, we hide that water. So this isn't the most sophisticated or difficult argument. The Lafitte Blue Way, the Lafitte Greenway now, was the Carondelet Canal. People 200 plus years ago put water there, and all we're saying is if you put the water back in there in this kind of configuration or something like that, without pumping, you can solve about 5/7 of the problem of flooding in that area. So which would have a better return on investment? Because this work has all got to be paid for by somebody, and that's what the analysis is coming back around the water board. So when it rains really hard, the water's there. The project, though, I'm coming to talk about is really Mirabeau, and this is City Park, which is adjacent, and not much here, but City Park can do a great amount of work, not only for the area that it is, but for the area adjacent. This thing we're operating in is a mix of surface water, drainage, and groundwater. And you have to balance this because the subsidence potential of the city is not exhausted, and we've already done a lot to put ourselves below sea level. It's fairly complicated, and I would tell you that the city is working hard right now to get models that allow this interaction to be calculated. So there is some hope within rooms in City Hall where we're trying to get our heads around this problem we have. There's also hope in boards and commissions like the City Park Board that after several years has willingly said they will take more water into the site, which benefits not only that area out there by Robert E. Lee, but Lakeview. So, and you know, City Park would then get an operating water system and you might be able to go in a canoe or something through it, which would also be beneficial. The call for systemic change, I'm sorry these are not aligning exactly, but the call for systemic change is what this is. This is not a matter of, I mean, yes, we need to clean up these agencies and we need to get them out of the 1920s. I mean, the Water Board may have made 1956, I'm not sure. But the nuns, the congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph, have this property out off Mirabeau. Many of you know it, some better than others. It flooded, got struck by lightning when they started to rebuild, and they said, well, that might be something, and we might want to think about this. We were lusting over land, looking at this stuff in Dutch dialogues in the water plan, noticed a large open parcel. Open land can store water. The paradigm of pumping, paving, piping, and pumping versus the paradigm that we've espoused, which is really about keeping it where it is, letting the leaf work, letting the grass work, letting the skin work, getting it in, storing it, and then pumping it only when you have to. This property has an effect on the adjacent areas, like City Park has an effect on the adjacent areas. Loyola affects Ursuline. Everything works down the slope. Everything works along. But the treasure is what we're losing. This property has the capacity to hold this is in 90% design, going to 100% design, has the capacity to hold about 11 million gallons worth of water that would have been in the streets. It offsets flooding in the area around it. It works progressively with a 1 to 3 inch storm or a 1 year storm. We have 2 basins in this property, a 2-year storm, a 10-year storm. And you see what it's doing is it's filling up. It reaches its capacity at a point, and then it's going to flood elsewhere. So it isn't by itself going to fix all the flooding, even in the adjacent areas, when you get the August 5th flood. So there are other things needed, but it has a great effect on that. It's also potentially an environmental education center. I show this quickly. It's about groundwater. It's about knowing what's in the ground. There's a science component to this. It's not that advanced. But it's essential that we understand what's in the land and what the land can do for us. There's a site plan here. The city's putting $12.5 million of HMGP funds into this. That's the first piece. The rest of it, those dotted places that are almost off the screen up there, are going to be buildings that are environmental education center that somebody's going to be able to use. I would quickly show you then at the different stages of flood. The site's at this, it rains a little bit, the site becomes this. It rains more and it fills up as a water course, and then it gets really wet. So these are places I think we want to experience, and that's really what I'm saying is the Sewage and Water Board's operations are operations. The city is ours to experience. This is our life that we're in. And if we take that life seriously, it's not only about how we see it as, let's say, regular people, but it's also the spiritual dimension. I'm at Loyola. The nuns are saying they want systemic change. This is a Zen garden where I was a couple of weeks ago. This is meant for contemplation. We're not supposed to be running through this life and trying to get it out of here. We're supposed to be living deeply in it. So that's the pitch.
Next we have Robert M. Verchek, who holds the Gautier St. Martin Chair in Environmental Law at Loyola University, New Orleans. He's also a senior fellow at Tulane University's Disaster Resilience Leadership Academy in the School of Social Work, and the president of the Center for Progressive Reform, a national policy institute focused on public health, public welfare, and environmental protection. Rob served in the Obama administration as Deputy Associate Administrator for Policy at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in 2009 and 2010, where he helped develop climate adaptation policy for the EPA and served on the President's Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. He's testified before Congress several times and represented environmental interests in front of the court briefs in cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Finally, Professor Verchek's writing focuses on environmental regulation, climate change adaptation, and the developing field of disaster law. Welcome, Professor Rob Verchek.
Thanks so much. So I'm the lawyer, and I'm going to tell you a story about a lawsuit pretty soon. But one thing that I want to point out, which I think is really interesting about the stories we're hearing so far, is these are stories about nature, partly, and nature's beautiful and contemplative, and we can recreate and all of the things that David talked about. The other thing that nature does is it provides us free services that we use and don't even know. But we think about it, we know that they are services worth money, because when we pave over everything and pipe, like David said, we take away those natural drainage services, water storage services, and then we have to build them back again with the sewage and water board, right? And instead of getting services free or taking advantage of things that are free and enjoyable at the same time, what we do instead is we try to rebuild the thing, and we have government trying to do that, and we have to keep our eye on government, and sometimes government works and sometimes it doesn't. The story I'm going to tell is a story about this natural infrastructure of a different kind, and also a story about government not working. That beautiful, one of the slides is beautiful, image of all those coastal wetlands, the largest coastal wetlands in North America. And it's in one state. You could take the Everglades National Park and drop it in our wetlands and never find them again, right? Because ours are just so huge and beautiful and astounding, and yet they're going away. And we know that they provide for fisheries and navigation, and also storm buffers and hurricane buffers for so many things that we rely on, including the safety of hundreds of thousands of people down here, all right? Now, we have a levee board that is responsible for protecting Orleans Parish and the two neighboring parishes on either side. And about 5 years ago or so, they started looking around and finding out, right, that when we're losing that wetland, it gets harder to protect the city that we're in right now from storm surge and from storms in general. And here was the problem. They took a look at information that has been freely available for a long time, including information from the oil and gas companies. And by the oil and gas companies' own estimation, the oil and gas industry is responsible for about 36% of all of that lost land. 36% of it, right? And other studies might take it up to as far as almost 60%, all right? So they started asking, well, why is that happening? Well, a lot of that is permitted. There are channels they put in the pipelines. There are 10,000 miles of pipelines, 50,000 wells in this area. The oil and gas companies have extracted something like $450 billion worth of oil and gas out of the land. And the permits that they have to do all of these things generally require them to make sure that the land doesn't erode, to make sure that they fill these things back when we're done using them. I mean, you know, sort of simple things. You make a mess, you clean it up, you use your property in a way that hurts other people, you apologize and do something about it, right? And so, but what they found out is that the government, and here's the failure part, the state government was not monitoring those permits. They were not enforcing anything. They were not telling these companies for years and decades to do anything about it. And so now you have another part of government, right, this little scrappy levee board that says, oh my gosh, we're another part of government that are in charge of protecting all these people. And the government we've been relying on at the state level hasn't been doing anything. So what can we do? Well, the one thing they found out is they can't police these permits. It's not their job. And so what they did was something rather creative. They said, well, maybe we could sue those 97 oil and gas companies for what they've done to us, which is make the job of protecting people in Orleans Parish way, way more expensive. Right, and so that's how this lawsuit happened. And there's a long, sort of history, twists and turns. The governor at the time opposed the lawsuit. Of course, the oil and gas companies opposed the lawsuit. They continued to go forward. And their basic claim was essentially that under the state's very own law, it's against the law to use your property in ways that hurt other people. And when you do that, you have to pay for it. Now, they lost at a trial court at the federal level, and they lost again on appeal in the federal courts. And part of the problem, from the point of view of the Levee Board, was that they had wished that they had had a hearing in front of a state court with state law. Right? They wanted to get a local jury, and they wanted to get judges whose job it was to apply state law to fill in gaps when everybody else is not doing their job, right? So what happens is essentially the oil and gas companies make the argument that they should be in federal court instead because the state laws really don't apply or help, all right? And they essentially argue that under the federal law, they have permission to destroy thousands of acres of wetlands, to endanger tens of thousands of people without paying for it. Because they say that the federal government laws allow them to do that. And so what I have been involved with is a group of about 25 law professors from around the country who specialize in the area of water management and of environmental law. We filed a friend of the court brief to the U.S. Supreme Court supporting the Levee Board's appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's a very sort of small technical issue. The issue, we talk a lot about the wetlands because that's really important to us, right? But the basic issue shouldn't it be that a state court gets to apply its own state law to decide whether its law has anything to say about what happens when you destroy tens of thousands of acres of land and endanger people? Shouldn't that at least be something that a state court gets to interpret its own state law to see if there's some kind of remedy from something like that? Because no state court has ever seen a case like that. There have been a couple federal courts who have, and when the federal courts look at it, they say, oh, the state law would never allow any kind of compensation from something like that, so we'll just take care of it for you. So what we're doing, we're somewhat hopeful. I don't know, exactly what will happen. If you want to think the more liberal side of the bench, you might say, well, we have a compelling environmental case and a compelling case about the protection of public safety. On the right of center, we have, I think, a very strong argument that this is about a state being able to use its own law to protect its own people within its borders, and that we ought not have to rely on whether the federal law says it's a good thing or a bad thing for oil companies to destroy so much of state land. So that's the argument that we're making, and we might pick up some conservative votes on an argument like that, because it is in some ways a case really about our own sovereignty in this state, our own ability to apply our own law to help our own people. And so we'll find out, and we'll see. I have no idea when we're going to get the answer on the appeal. It'll be happening sometime this term, I assume. And if it goes forward, then there'll be more fireworks. And if it doesn't, they're going to have to all regroup and figure it out again.
Last, but certainly not least, we have Tyler Antrup, who serves as the Urban Water Program Manager for the City of New Orleans. leading coordination of the city's drainage and green infrastructure programs across all departments and agencies. He holds a master's degree in sustainable real estate development from a university in New Orleans that shall be unnamed, and a bachelor's degree in urban planning and design from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He's also a member of the Mayor's Office of Resilience and Sustainability. He's at hard work on the implementation of the city's newly developed resilience strategy, a project 10 years in the making. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Andrew.
Thank you. First, I'd just like to say thank you to Loyola for allowing me to step in at the last minute. Unfortunately, Jeff couldn't be here this evening. I just kind of wanted to start off by sort of talking about more broadly about how we got to where we are with the city of New Orleans. I've been really privileged to sort of start and then continue my career working in New Orleans in the water space, and have been with the city for about 2.5 years and have been able to witness an almost complete 180 in the direction that the city has gone in terms of their view of water management and capital projects and the way that we just think about how we live in our environment. And so most of that is to the credit of the sort of grassroots activism of a lot of people, many of whom are in this room, David Wagner, for really leading the charge and putting pressure on the city to make new priorities. And so that activism has led to a number of things, the sort of birth in City Hall of which was the release in 2015 of our resilience strategy, Resilient NOLA. That was a plan that was developed with assistance from the Rockefeller Foundation, part of their 100 Resilient Cities program. We were the first in the world to release our resilient strategy, and it did win an award from the American Planning Association. That plan really lays out a roadmap for how the city can become more resilient in a way that is multifaceted and addresses our existential issues in the city. We recognize that in order for us to continue to exist in this environment, we have to address a number of things in addition to water management, that being energy, climate, and economic issues. And so what the strategy really lays out is a roadmap for how we can use a number of different strategies for solving these issues, but the crown jewel of which is green infrastructure. The green infrastructure is the most important part of the plan in that it addresses all aspects of the resilient strategy through its multiple benefits. And so what we're really trying to do is create an entirely new culture, both within City Hall, but also within the citizens of New Orleans, towards an approach of living with water, so that we can use that culture to transform our physical ecosystem, our economy, and really to create a more resilient environment in general. We've worked to really embed that thinking into the city in a number of ways through the creation of a resilient project design review committee, in which all city projects have to go through in order to check them to make sure they're compliant with our resilient strategy. By updating our master plan this year, the City Planning Commission is really working to embed the language of resilient NOLA into the city's master plan, which has the force of law. And then also, of course, to the creation of the Office of Resilience and Sustainability, which I have the pleasure of serving in. We're now an office with a staff of 15. I work on urban water issues. We have people with expertise in coastal issues, energy efficiency, climate, and design, community engagement, and economics. And really, the way that we are jumpstarting this work is both through our allocation from the National Disaster Resilience Competition of $142 million to develop the Gentilly Resilience District, and a number of other federal funding sources that we're grateful to have, which is going to give us over $200 million to build green infrastructure in New Orleans. And so where we're focused right now in this work is really sort of tying in the pieces of where the urban water plan left off, and we're working very closely with David to do that, and really drilling down into the issues that David was talking about exactly, which is our groundwater, our surface water, and our soils, and how they're all connected. We realize now that while we've done a decent job of being able to get the water out of the city during most rain events, there are other issues that we have not addressed, like how we manage our groundwater, which has led to subsidence, which obviously has gotten us into a lot of issues with all of our infrastructure, water lines, drainage lines, roads, homes, all included. And so we need to look at how we can start to actively manage that groundwater in a way that's sustainable so that we don't lose another inch of our elevation as the sea continues to rise. We need to find new ways to increase surface water in the city so that we can continue to recharge our groundwater, to create that culture of living with water through making it more visible, and take advantage of the multiple benefits of green infrastructure through climate mitigation, energy efficiency, and then finally addressing our soils and how we can continue to live in this delta environment, and really work to live with water in the challenging environment that we have. And so I'm excited to address any issues that you bring up, but we're really focused on just making sure that we can do the best we can by the plans that have been put in place.
Thanks. So in David's introduction, he mentioned the need for systemic change. And I'd like to ask the question of all of you. What do you consider to be the two most important priorities with regard to water resource management in the New Orleans metropolitan area? Two most important priorities. Any one of you at any time.
I'll start, I guess. I mean, I certainly think we, as I was just saying, and David too, you know, that, yeah, we spent most of our afternoon today talking about this, is our issues with groundwater. You know, there's, it's something that it's not a sexy topic, it's not talked about often, but, you know, it's something that we don't really fully understand. And so I think that our region depends on getting a real strong grasp on how our soils and our groundwater interact, and how we can start to actively manage our groundwater in a way that will allow us to sustain ourselves. And then I think second would be the constant challenge in the city of New Orleans with revenue and finance, and just how do we, you know, we've been very successful in leveraging philanthropic and private funding to put this down payment down on our implementation of the Greater New Orleans Urban Water Plan. But moving forward, you know, the city really has no dedicated revenue stream for drainage or green infrastructure. And so how do we identify funds? How do we, as a community, prioritize funding this work so that we can continue to do it?
Now, I was going to say the, I don't know, the most, but important for getting people involved. It's not possible to do this if people aren't educated, don't understand, don't participate. The Netherlands wasn't built without some kind of consensus. So the model we work through together to figure out how and where has political import too. But first of all, to get people involved, I think the other is we've got to make this visible. The challenge we have is that we spend a ton of money. We spend about $1 billion on drainage canals on Louisiana, Napoleon, and Jefferson, and you don't see any of it. And how on earth can you manage something you can't see? And we have residual, you saw the canal walls and the outfall canal. It's out of sight, out of mind. And then it comes and it's a plague instead of a benefit. So I think concentrating on making this a visible system, and then, you know, leveraging the nature that comes with that, and we're part of that ecological activism at that point.
We have to talk about climate change. Climate change is going to affect almost everything that you care about in this city, in this state, and really in the country. And specifically, it is going to be affecting sea level rise more and precipitation patterns. There's a reason there were 3 500-year events in the last, 3 or 5 years in Houston. And it's not because those were all 500-year events. If you apply climate projections, there's something different from that. And we've got to understand that and own it and be able to talk about it frankly, even if we don't like knowing maybe what the solution might be. I mean, I think one of the problems that we have is we think, oh, the solution is going to mean more government and more international cooperation. And I think there are some folks who are like, oh, I don't want to go there, so I don't want to admit there's a problem, right? Because this is something you can't solve in your church or your mosque or with a bake sale. It's something that's a lot bigger and maybe more unfamiliar to some or scary, but it has to be done.
Well, I mean, I would echo what David said. I think citizen involvement and people actually getting behind an issue and doing something about it is really imperative. In my line of work, we can write reports and make recommendations till the cows come home, but unless people pay attention to it and demand the change, it's just a piece of paper on the table. So, I mean, I think that's really key. And I just wanted to, I think it was interesting when we went to the Sewage and Water Board for their exit conference. We meet with them at the end of right before a project is released publicly for their feedback. And one of the things they said to us when we were talking about the what we saw as an elevated risk, and we had the science behind us, of exposure to lead due to the infrastructure reconstruction that's going on, what we were told was, well, we don't deal in hypotheticals. Well, I think, you have to start believing the science, and, until you do that, there's really nothing to be done. So I think that's a huge, huge thing.
You mentioned earlier this issue of accountability in your opening remarks. And as a historian, what I've looked at was interactions between engineers and politicians and urban planners and activists and so forth. And I'm very interested in this tension between technocracy and democracy. When is it necessary for authoritative decisions to be made? How is that process worked out? And one of the interesting things that's been occurring in this campaign cycle is the decision, or the question of whether or not the Sewage and Water Board needs to become a city department, which it would require the state to get involved because it's a independent agency created by the state. The city charter would have to be amended to accommodate these things. But what is the likelihood of success if the board were brought into the city as a department? What assurances do we have that there would be more thorough accountability?
I mean, and there are never any guarantees. I mean, it's the history is cyclical, right? The reason it's a board, in large part, was because when it was the discussion about it being formed was happening, there was, politics was so corrupt, people just said, no way, we're going to put this with the government. It needs to be its own board, and we'll have upstanding members of the community on the board, and they're going to make the right decisions for everyone. Here we are now. This was almost 100 years ago. We're now talking about possibly going the other direction. I think what's true, however, is that with boards, as I think I demonstrated with my questions, it's a black box. The Sewage and Water Board, I think, has been doing its thing for 100 years now. And they, frankly, from everything that we've found, haven't been doing a bang-up job. And I think, there aren't too many people now who would argue that, there aren't problems there. And the culture, I think, is so ingrained at this point that there really does have to be some kind of a structural change. And at least if it's part of government, there are elected officials who have authority over it, and they're accountable to people, and people know who they are. You will see meetings, they will come before the council committee meetings. They will, they will be a more public presence. And I think the hope is, and I think the reason that Inspector General Quatrevo made the recommendation or sees this as the only, real way to go at this point is because, having that public presence and making them more visible is just about the only thing that can then sort of catapult change. And whether it'll work or not, I think, like I say, there are no guarantees, but, it's a continuum, right? You've got a public agency, it's part of the department, the city on one end, and you've got a private agency on the other. And there's lots of space in between. Boards are just this sort of no man's land out here that operates invisibly. And so that seems to be a problem.
Well, part of what you're doing with the mayor's office is to try to bring a greater degree of collaboration and cooperation among these various commissions. Drainage is covered by two different departments. Well, there's the Sewage and Water Board, but there's also the Department of Public Works, which deals with the sort of minor drainage system. And sometimes it appears that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and this is becoming incredibly problematic. I've also noticed that the issue of privatization is incredibly unpopular here in New Orleans. I was at a mayoral forum a while back, and it came up, and there were boos and hisses. And only one candidate would even entertain the idea. So for the benefit of students and those who are unaware of this issue, what explains some of the hostility to privatize management, public ownership, but privatize management, such as the East Bank wastewater treatment plant, which Veolia privately manages. Entergy is a private energy provider with government oversight, both from the state and the city council. Models like that, why are they uniformly dismissed here in the city? Anyone want to touch it?
You know, I think the water board is broken. I think that you're going to see something of that kind in the short run. I think that there has to be some period of just trying to get the act together and figure out what needs to happen. You know, private corporations have, in my experience, are not the answer to everything. If you go back, and I go off back toward the history question, which is easier, I think. The Water Board was a proud organization. You know, it was founded to do this work in New Orleans, and in some ways it was state of the art in 1920, and it didn't change. It ossified. It was a white male organization. In about 1960, I heard that the best job an engineer in America could have would be the chief engineer of the Sewage and Water Board, operating all these pumps and machines. It's a bad kind of model built into that for our time. They ignored information. Were they held accountable? Not, apparently. And then it became a patronage condition, I believe, and maybe that's not right to say, but I think it became that, and that was a place, you know, like highway departments in our state. There's something about the separation between private and public in America that's not healthy. In the Netherlands, you know, the most responsible entity is the water board. It gets taxes, highly respected, and it's full of white men. But the point is, it's a responsibility that isn't just transferred to that official, but it's understood as one between neighbors. And somehow we're almost not even asking the right question in a way about who's going to operate it. It's operate what? You could ask. I asked the question sort of dangerously. Does it even really want to be a single parish authority? You know, the Monticello Canal is between two, and the water from Jefferson comes into it. The 17th Street Canal really could provide a lot of water into canals that run east-west in Jefferson, and you can do some things that way. The Lake Borgne Levee District is actually, it's hard to say this that St. Bernard's got the better model, but it's the levees and the drainage. Mm-hmm. And they operate together, and they don't have a nickel to do either. But the point is that separating the flood protection from the water management is also kind of arbitrary. And you name Sewage and Water Board and DPW, but in the other model, you know, the parks would have to participate, parks and parkways, and it's hard to keep cutting it up without trying to understand how something more that's put together. I mean, but the model failed. They ignored information for a long time. They were single purpose, and you know, it was dominated by engineers.
Step back to a broader question here. and since the 90s, the term sustainability has gotten a lot of traction, a lot of mileage. Now we're increasingly finding that sustainability is competing with resiliency. What do you think to be differences, if they exist, between these two terms? And what are the policy implications?
Well, I spent a lot of time thinking and writing about resilience and putting it in the title of things because people like to read it. But I think you're right. I think you're right. We all know we're in favor of sustainability and we're all in favor of resilience. And I think that maybe one thing that separates them is that resilience is about coping and surviving or enduring a certain kind of a stress on a system. And if we're talking about a social system, hopefully bouncing back in a better way, building back better, as they say. And all of that is really appealing. And I think it's actually really true because what we see when we're looking at these storms, for instance, and so on, are our own problems is a lot of life, right? Is about being robust and bouncing back. And it's about not knowing what it is the stress is going to be, but knowing that you have the wherewithal, you hope, or the resources to kind of bounce back, which is why you stay healthy, right? You don't eat right just to avoid a particular disease. You eat right and exercise because you don't know what's coming, but you want to be fit, when it happens. So I think all of that's good. I think, though, that the problem is we don't, as I think you imply, really define resilience very well, and then therefore we can say that whatever it is we're interested in doing is resilience and try to sell it that way, and that's a problem.
Yeah, and I think I think that was pretty targeted at my office. But I think the reason why we chose to include both in the name of our office is because I think there are specific connotations that people put on each. And I think you're right that resilience is very broad. Sustainability, on the other hand, people tend to associate with environmental causes, with being green. And so I think for us in our work, our focus is on really taking a much more broad view of resilience. And so, we focus not just on environmental sustainability, but we also focus on economic resilience or sustainability, and on energy economics and resiliency. And we really want to make sure that all of the work that we are doing sort of ticks all the boxes, and that's what we mean when we say resilience.
I think that's really important, incidentally, is that social aspect of resilience.
Right.
Economic, social.
Cohesion,
racism
Yes.
is an assault on resilience,
Correct.
and so and crime and all of these things. So I think that's a really important.
I think a lot of this came out of when Sandy happened in New York. The lessons of New Orleans were important, and the single purpose way we built back, and the poverty that was here, and then Rockefeller invested, I don't know how much money, in making resilience the framework. And so, I think it's done a lot of good. I had a friend who this week said resilience means you can meddle in other people's business, which is kind of curious because that's what you guys do. You meddle in public works. And so these resilience offices are actually set up to go and kind of fiddle around in other departments. But in Louisiana, I think the coastal program where those graphics were made and other things, but it's the Louisiana SAFE NDRC grant, the National Disaster Resilience Competition. The A is adaptation. And so for me, we're sort of in the disaster avoidance business, and we have to adapt. And sustainability, all these terms become tired. But the lessons learned by others as they looked at what was built back here in New Orleans that were single purpose and didn't really improve the, poverty quotient, didn't have any community input to speak of. I'm not talking about the UNOP plan and stuff like that. I'm talking about the levees, the $15 billion. And so they weren't seen as resilient. They didn't do the other things. They didn't check those boxes that we have to check. And those boxes are really helpful to have to check.
I think if I can also say one more thing, expanding on that too, is I think as a society, I think we tend to have difficulty planning for the future. We don't really often think in terms of long term. We're much more focused on instant gratification. And I think to David's point about sort of how we interact with city government, what our job is in city government, we're sort of like a policy shop that gets to go and stir things up and tell people to do their jobs a different way that we think is better. And so I think that, what we're doing is trying to make everyone start thinking about the long term. So instead of, fixing a pothole, it's about fixing the street so that the pothole doesn't happen and so that it manages water better and so that the house on that street doesn't flood anymore. Because if we just fix the pothole, we're going to have to come back and fix the pothole again next year and the year after that, and we're just literally throwing money in a hole.
And if you don't examine the root cause, I heard today, Jeff, who's not here, I'll tell his story again, that Jeff Davis Parkway, a street in search of a new name, which is the end of Bayou St. John, the bayou used to come into that zone, has been repaved 6 times, he said, since Katrina, and it keeps falling apart. Well, you're building in a creek bed, you're building in a bayou, and you're building it as if you were on land in Alexandria or something, and not Egypt. So we got to go to the root causes of things with some ambition about what we want, and maybe I want that, and somebody else does too, but what's desirable now and over time? What do you want over time? And that's where the resilience thing really comes in, because it's not just about this time, but it's generational. What do we want to achieve? And that was not the question the Corps of Engineers was asking when they came to repair the levees. They were saying, how do I get this done now and move on? How can I pave the street and close the contract?
Looking at the contracts and the numerous projects that are going on in the city. Again, the Sewage and Water Board has 3 different operations going on. Whether it's water supply, there's water treatment, then there's the drainage. Right? And they're all funded in different ways. And I was thinking about the challenges that lie before the city, particularly with regard to financing some of these capital improvement projects. The federal government has thrown the city a lifeline. There's no doubt about it. FEMA money that has helped with the SELA project, sort of a godsend. There was a consent decree back in '98. That's paid for by user fees, essentially, ratepayers. But we're running against a problem with the stormwater system and the lack of a way to pay for it. And I'm curious about what sort of funding strategies do we see going forward? What are the options? Again, current candidates are not exactly warm about stormwater fees or increased property taxes. But how do we reconcile that with a number of exemptions that exist? And what do we do?
Well, one idea is to try to tie the use of these, I'll call them they're not natural systems, but we think again that sort of drainage is something that you just get for free when the water falls off of your roof. And I know that, in some cities, there's actually, you have provisions about how much water you're allowed to produce in terms of stormwater that's going to go into your drainage system. And you could imagine a system that said, well, here's your limit, or if you want to have all of your water drain off into the street, then we're going to charge you a little bit for it. But if you want to have a rain garden or you want to do other things that are going to contain the water on your site, we won't charge you as much because you're not using as much. And so in some ways, creating a pseudo market in these kinds of services, I think in some ways can help.
I know the Bureau of Governmental Research has run a recent report on stormwater service fees. And the Comprehensive Zoning Ordinance, Article 23, looks at commercial buildings of more than 5,000 square feet. So there are some options that are there. And Tyler and I were talking about new kinds of green funds that have been utilized. And I'm curious to know if you could Or would you be willing to speak on this?
Sure, and I think I can speak to your previous question too, and I think, like you said, BGR just recently released a report on stormwater use fees. I think what's interesting is most people don't realize that the city has attempted twice before to adopt stormwater user fees, once in 1983 and once in 1999, both of which followed large flood events. So it's kind of like we're in Groundhog Day in terms of every time there's a flood, we say, oh no, we're not making enough money, we have to figure out a way to fix this. And I can't even begin to speak to the operations of the Sewage and Water Board or their intent and how they want to finance things. But what I can say, I think, is that in order for us to finance this work, I think there needs to be a change in the citizens of New Orleans to prioritize the work. As it stands, I think one of the biggest priorities for funding over the last probably 5 years in the city has been first the police and second street paving. And so I think if whatever has been so successful in those campaigns to sort of galvanize funding for those programs were to happen on water management, imagine what we could do. In terms of what options are available to us, I think, there are a number of different innovative finance tools that we're looking at. We're working with some people in the Northwest on how they're using some different specific municipal accounting guidelines in order to bond green infrastructure so that you can categorize it as an asset in ways that I don't understand because I'm not an accountant. And really also looking at ways that we can sort of leverage the funds that we can raise. So one of the things you mentioned is Article 23. Part of that regulation currently sort of contemplates for there eventually to be a fee in lieu of compliance option. The regulation didn't set it up. It didn't give specifics. It didn't provide a process or a fee, but it did contemplate that could exist. So we're currently working on doing that. The City Planning Commission is supposed to be taking it up in a few weeks. And so we're going to be looking to put together a program where if a developer has a site that is truly challenged, where they aren't able to comply, they can pay a fee based on the amount of storage that they would have had to provide under the law and pay that to us, and we can build green infrastructure with it. And what we're thinking right now is that, we can probably do a better job in a lot of ways in that, if you have a 5,500 square foot lot line to lot line building historic in the French Quarter that you can't, fit a cistern or a green roof or something on for whatever reason, or even if you could, that for the amount of money that we would get for that, we could probably manage a whole lot more water and make a lot more impact. And so we're looking at ways that we can leverage those types of funding sources in order to sort of stand up a larger program.
Maybe random comments almost, but I mean, we have Tyler enforces this stuff, so he's kind of the police on some of this. I'm an architect, and we have a project in the quarter for historic New Orleans collection, and it's quite costly to build that in because there is no industry here. We have no business culture in this city. These are opportunities to make money, but everybody's reluctant to engage the new opportunity because it's not the way we do it. And, it's a culture of, I think maybe the tax avoidance idea will work. I mean, one of the great minds in my lifetime in finance was Russell Long, Huey's son. You're a historian, and he had that phrase, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the guy behind the tree. And he ran the finance committee. So we're at Loyola, and we're next to Audubon Park, both of whom contribute greatly to the stormwater burden in the city, and neither of whom pay anything for that. So the institutional gaps that are there, nonprofits don't pay any property tax to deal with this. They contribute, they're not doing their part. So we really have to look at ourselves and say, do we want to live here? Who's going to pay to support the levees? That motivates me all the time. We had a $15 billion investment. The Dutch formula is 0.5% a year for maintenance, $75 million a year. Where's that money come from? So, it gets into a real quandary because we don't even want to make the first steps, and we got to attract a lot more people to help us pay for this. And you want equity, and you want to not turn this into a city that doesn't look like New Orleans.
And that was the question I wanted to lead to, was equity. How do you prioritize space? Right? What areas have development? How do we pay for it? What does that look like?
So, I mean, I think I can definitely speak to the equity issue that we deal with in our office and with our projects. I think part of the existential an issue with equity in New Orleans is that our most vulnerable neighborhoods are the most unequal. The areas of the city that flood the most often have, most of which have, the census tracts have over 75% are people of color. There have a much higher proportion of low and moderate income families. And so there is an inherent equity issue in the way that we manage water today. And so as we look to invest in ways to better manage water, it makes sense to invest in those areas first, so that we can manage the water and stem the flooding and also provide the multiple benefits that come with green infrastructure. I think what it also comes down to is that in sort of trying to create this new culture of living with water, we're going to be creating a new economy. Like David said, right now it's very expensive to do this stuff because there's very little capacity in the contracting field to build this stuff. Most of the contractors don't want to do it because it's a pain, not because they don't know how or they can't. They just don't want to, because they're probably not going to build another one like it for another couple of years. It's just not common enough yet. And so I think what my office is really focused on is that we're trying to create a workforce program that prepares people at all levels to qualify for jobs. And what we're also trying to do is we're trying to prioritize disadvantaged businesses so that they are the most qualified to do the work. And so therefore, even in the private sector, are the first priority. And so if anyone's familiar with the way that the airport has worked, they have a first source clause in their contract so that if a contractor's hiring someone to work on that project, they have to draw from the city's pool of trained workers first. And so we're looking to try to mirror that program for our green infrastructure programs. We're partnering with Delgado and the Greater New Orleans Foundation to stand up a number of workforce training programs at all levels, from the very low level of how do you weed a bioretention area all the way up to how are you an engineer who can design something like the Miracle Water Garden. And so we're hoping that in doing that, we can create a more equitable economy around water by making it as open and as accessible as possible to all New Orleanians.
One question I have about that I don't have an answer to, but I'm just going to put it out there, is this contributes to gentrification, I would think, right? As you increase property values because you're putting amenities, and that helps people who are owners, but it doesn't help people who are renters who might be pushed out of those areas. How do you deal with that?
I think that's an excellent question. I think it's the gentrification is an issue that everyone's struggling to wrap our minds around and how to solve. I think that we also have a severe housing crisis in the city that we need to solve. That is a huge part of that. And so I think the work that we're trying to do is really to try to focus on taking the folks who may be displaced and connecting them to opportunities in the industry so that as we're building the green infrastructure in their neighborhoods, they're able to be the ones that are building it or maintaining it and have the opportunities to earn a wage in order to stay so that they can benefit from that increase.
Yeah, it's definitely it's a judgmental word. It carries all the judgment with it as you say it. And another one that shouldn't be as judgmental, but in New Orleans, in its strange way, at times is densification. Mm-hmm. And you don't have enough people living in the city to sustain it. So you better get more people living here at some point. It seems to me that those two words together would offer some hope, because you can design a more inclusive housing program, jobs program, and then, whatever commercial things one group or another want will be different, but they aren't that different. People want food, they want certain things, and people generally want healthy food. But we have space in New Orleans. I mean, I don't know how many, we're around here tonight, it's fairly dense. But there's a lot of space. I mean, go check New Orleans East. It's a lot of space. There's a lot of space out there. There's a lot of space in Gentilly. It's a carpet city, but it's far apart, and we don't even manage water well when we have all that space. We're not being very intelligent about how to solve these problems. And I do think that's where New Orleans becomes the opportunity. It's 12 years after the storm or something. We're still a laboratory. You can still claim that. That's pretty good for us. We're still relevant. People come here from all over the country and world to talk about what's going on in New Orleans. Something's going on still. I mean, we're here at 8 o'clock or whatever, 9 o'clock at night on a Thursday, and people haven't walked out. So we're still trying.
And before it gets too
One guy did.
Yeah.
and before it gets too late, I'd like to open the floor to any questions from folks in the audience. Welcome you all.
Opposite we have
Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Here we go. Hello. So I saw a question over on this side. So please, everybody, just try and be, quick to the point. Thanks.
Dr. Verchik, you stole my thunder with that gentrification thing. So I'll ask a different one. I'm just down from Atlanta, which likes to call itself the city in a forest. Sometimes a little more than it deserves. But I just moved into the Florida area on Desire Street, and I look around and I say, where are all my big trees? Where are all the fact wets and obligates that would help suck up the groundwater, stabilize the soil? Maybe some were lost in Katrina, y'all can tell me, but, Atlanta keeps these tree planting programs going and going and going, and I wonder if that is part of the Water City plan, if it can be, if anything like that is happening in New Orleans. Thanks.
Yeah, so the city of New Orleans lost over 50% of our tree canopy after Hurricane Katrina, so that's part of it, a big part of it. I think, to answer the second part of your question, I think part of our climate action strategy, which was released in July, which I failed to mention earlier, is to increase the canopy. I think it's 50%. I can't remember the exact, there's too many percentages in my head, but to significantly increase the tree canopy on public land in the city. I think there's also a number of other things we can do, both to encourage tree planting and also to preserve the existing trees we have. I know one of the things that was included in the update to the master plan was to, within the next 5 years, create a tree preservation ordinance and to inventory all trees in the city. Because right now there are no regulations around trees in the city. There's, you technically have to get the permission of Parks and Parkways to cut down a public tree, but enforcement is difficult, and there's no regulations at all for private trees on private land. We have a sort of basic idea of where trees are and what they are based on aerial imagery, but we haven't been able to go out and actually survey them. We're sort of, again, putting a down payment on that with the Gentilly Resilience District. The Department of Parks and Parkways is going to be inventorying all the public trees in Gentilly with arborists to sort of give you the approximate age, size, species, health, all of that, and then with the hopes of expanding that citywide so that once we have a baseline of what we have, then we can prioritize, where and what species do we want to plant in other places. And also in New Orleans, frankly, tree canopy is an equity issue as well. If you look, the neighborhoods that are the wealthiest are the shady ones. And so in terms of our climate strategy, that's why it's in there, because we know that the most vulnerable neighborhoods are the hottest because they don't have any trees. And so how do we prioritize planting trees in those neighborhoods in order to encourage better living conditions in those areas?
Hi. Speaking about the economic issues and the green infrastructure, it seems to me that the fossil fuel industry here is bringing in lots and lots of money, and it's a huge contributor to the greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Is there some way that we can be looking more at how we can be transitioning away from fossil fuels, making sure that we're respecting the people that work in that industry, to green jobs making New Orleans not only resilient but also a leader in the U.S. for moving towards a green economy?
And the city has had really robust, to use one of those phrases, adoption of PV cells because of state subsidies, the combination of federal and state subsidies. And the Alliance for Affordable Energy is urging the city council to muscle up on its regulatory authority over Entergy, to really collaborate in pushing some of these greener technologies for power generation. Specifics, I can't tell you. I'm not an engineer. But I would encourage you to look at the Alliance and to look at their exchanges with Entergy.
I'll just make a quick point just about jobs and so on, because of course that's what so many people think about when they think of the fossil fuel industry. I was surprised to learn that it's only around, I think it's like 16% of jobs in Louisiana are linked to oil and gas, at least according to one study. And if you look at the transition to the green economy and all of the things that means, there are very few states that have a net loss in jobs. Louisiana is not one of them. In fact, Louisiana would have a net gain in jobs with the transition of a green economy, which is not to say that some people won't lose them, right? And that's what we've got to figure out. And I think your question suggests we need to be attentive to that.
Yeah, but one of the interesting things is, I think it was last week, the Times-Picayune or the Advocate reported that Lake Charles, Louisiana, is among the top, one of the fastest growing urban areas in the country, and it's directly attributable to natural gas, liquefied natural gas in particular. So it's cleaner than coal, certainly, but it still contributes to global climate change.
Yeah, and it puts you on a path of dependence you don't want to be in.
What we heard in Terrible and Parish was kind of interesting, because they say, well, oil and gas always comes back. And when it comes back, it pays at a higher rate than the other jobs. So you never can grow the other economy, because oil and gas comes back and pays you another $20,000 if you're a welder or something. Instead of going into the water industry to learn how to manipulate that hydraulic system, they go back. It's kind of it's the story of Louisiana. But I think that the commitment and the generational commitment has got to be there. I mean, it's not the future.
And if I can speak directly too, again, I encourage everyone to check out our climate action strategy. Our climate action coordinator is going to be furious that I don't know all these percentages off the top of my head, but there are specific targets for reducing single-use car trips and also transitioning public vehicles to natural gas, biomass, other things. So I definitely encourage you to take a look at what our plans are for doing that.
This question is for Mr. Wagner. We seem to have a lot of engineering in this town that is struggling to find a place to go because of the gas and oil boom and bust cycle. And do you think an engineer that's been a gas and oil guy can retool himself quick enough to be of help in this? And do we really need that type of engineering help, or do we already know what we want? It's just getting the political will to do it.
It's kind of a couple questions, but I was in Jakarta one time, and Chevron was advertising that they are a water company because the piping and all the extraction that's involved is related to that. I think that the question would be it's just a way of thinking. I mean, engineers have to solve the problem. Engineers are eager to get to the answer, and sometimes we have to sort of like the administrative routine for the water board to do what. Architects frustrate engineers because we kind of stay with what are we trying to do longer. I think if the engineer puts his mind, her mind to the problem we have here and the interface between these surface waters and groundwaters and all that, and starts to understand this, it's a fun world again for this discipline. Engineers need a different kind of training. I don't think the school has a lot of invested. You don't have a big engineering program, do you? Yeah. But I think that the mechanical versus the natural system, the way this is, it's a different way of thinking slightly, but it goes back to the way that engineers can analyze and engineers can accomplish. Let's hope. I mean, because we can't build it without. So, but it is a transition. It's not the hardest transition because it's still hydraulics.
Okay, we're up here.
So I actually have a degree in environmental engineering, and I like to think that I have a deep understanding of water systems, especially with like managing groundwater in relation to using surface water as a source of recharge. So my question is, how do you make those concepts accessible to the general public in a way that will keep them interested and encourage them to be involved?
If you have any ideas, let me know.
That's part of the work we have in this Gentilly Resilience District, is to try to create communication materials that explain this stuff for an interested person. You can't force it down somebody, you know, I mean, but we've worked before to try to tell people what it was and how it does, how it interacts. It's, you know, we'll illustrate it and try. Hopefully you can help us try to make sure it's clear enough. But that goes back to the first point, which is to get people to understand where they live. You know, we forgot we live in a delta. We forgot we're a delta city. We thought we were, I often say, as Grasshopper, you know, Bossier City, you know. Thankfully, we're not.
Yeah, and
From up there, so.
I think it's also about just creating that personal connection to what it is. I think everyone that lives in New Orleans sees the impacts of our poor groundwater management. But I don't think that people understand that that's what it is.
Yes.
People know that our roads are really bad. People know that their homes need to be reshored all the time. People know that, you know, the water, sometimes the ground is too wet for the water to infiltrate. But what they don't know is why. And so I think it's really all about explaining what the problem is and the solution in a way that makes them realize that they're connected.
It actually just occurred to me. Show of hands if you do not know what subsidence is. There's a few people here, a few people there, right? I was at the coffee shop the other day, and I just kind of was rattling off about stuff, and I said subsidence, and people were like, what? So backed up and used the analogy of a sponge. Would you all mind explaining, please? Your concise elevator talk on subsidence.
I mean, it's shrinkage of land, and the water is out of the ground, and like a sponge, it's reduced in dimension. It can be, it's happening in organic soils, and it can be oxidation, so that it's forever gone into the atmosphere. So it's basically elevation diminished. Some subsidence is there. There's a shrink swell cycle that's what's tearing up the streets in a lot of the city. Subsidence is what happens in the organic soils, in the lowlands, in the peat landscapes. So did I do anything to make it clear? Subsidence is the shrinkage of the soil. Imagine a sponge.
Soil. Correct. And ultimately what New Orleans did was we had too much water. So we created these large canals, pipes to evacuate water, and it then deprived the landscape of the water it needed to remain spongy.
So back to the Sewage and Water Board. They put a drainage system in place in 1920 with the pumps. In 1928, I believe, there's a graphic that shows that this drainage system is shrinking the soil. So a few years later, they understood that subsidence was in fact occurring because the ground is shrinking. Worse than that is that in 1936, it was monitored that the groundwater, the removal of groundwater was raising the ambient temperature in the air by 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're making the city hotter and sinking it, and you didn't stop. You didn't moderate the regime. You continue to pump only. It's not responsible. The feedback loop has got to be a little quicker than a century. Joke's on us, right?
But it also speaks about the difficulty of like changing these massive systems on a dime, the risk aversion. What does the regulatory landscape look like? Where's the funding going to come from? You put these systems in, they're supposed to live a lifetime, right? To service 3 or 4 generations. They're amortized over 30 years. We're bonds. So there's a kind of momentum that's carrying us forward. And I think what he's asking through gardens such as this, we stop and, or another hackneyed phrase, we become a little more mindful and intentional.
I want to add something as a former regulator, I don't know, faceless bureaucrat, that's what I was, when I was at the EPA in DC. And one of the things that you find that actually is, I think, really explains part of what's going on is that when you have funding mechanisms that come from, let's say, the federal government, and it goes to the Army Corps, it goes to wherever. They want to make sure that they know exactly how it's going to work and that it passes what they call their benefit cost analysis and so on, because they don't want to be throwing good money after bad because it's all of our money and they want to take care of it. But the problem with that is so then when you have a choice between getting money for these big pipes like they're putting on Jefferson in front of my house, right? Or doing something creative like in Gentilly, they'll say, you know what, we know how pipes work, we know how concrete works, we have lots of formulas that tell us exactly whether that's good for benefit cost in ratio. But we don't know about how these massive sponge-like parks are going to work and the bioswales and all that. It sounds great, but we just don't have the information for it. And so that's why, for instance, the resilience grant that's coming in, we don't. Part of the reason that was so wonderful to have this demonstration pilot project was because we can spend that money and then monitor it and then see how it works and then get the data. But a lot of times we don't have the data. We only have the data for the old stuff, which is the concrete stuff. And the new stuff, you know, it's a little risky, but no politician wants to spend money on risky things.
Well, and
I think that's part of it.
No professional. I mean, I'm an architect. I can be sued. No engineer. I mean, you don't get sued for the status quo.
Yeah.
It's also, though, just not necessarily an issue of will or funding even. It's just an issue of, like, the scale of the problem, you know? When we're talking about subsidence and these systems, and it's just so complex in that, you know, the way our drainage system works, we have these pipes that are not sealed. They're just the pipes that fit together one by one. And so what's happening is when they talk about the pumping stations and they talk about constant duty pumps versus drainage pumps, the constant duty pumps are running constantly. They're constantly pumping water out of the soil. So our groundwater is artificially lowered at all times unless we get a really big rain. And so David and I talk because he's working in Norfolk, Virginia as well, where they have all the same problems as us, but their pipes are sealed so that the water can't get into them. And so the conversation we've had is like, which is better? We're not sure.
You know,
and so
this is a good one, though, because I like, you know, the story about you come to the table together and you all complain and you have your problems, and at the end of it, you take yours back because you'd rather have yours. You'd rather have ours than Norfolk's, I think, you know?
Well,
I mean, their economy is completely dependent on the federal government and the military. They flood without rainfall at high tide. They've got hundreds of miles of waterfront, no levee possible that they could afford or anything else. I mean, New Orleans has, for a period of time, a possibility to prosper. It has that possibility. And I don't know if it's 50 years or 100 years or longer. I don't foresee that. But, you know, we have a chance to live very well here and do a lot of creative things and model for each other and for the rest of places, you know. But we better get our heads around pretty boring things like where the pipes are and what the joints are between pipes and the underground. You know, that's not what I started out at architecture school to figure out. You know, the plumbing diagrams were pretty dull. But that's the city that we've inherited. You know, it was said with this behind me that we started out with a providential landscape, Garden of Eden. And we had a romantic landscape. The English landscape was a romantic landscape, and the gentry was in the romantic landscape. And then we've gotten to a functional landscape. And basically, this landscape is functional, and it doesn't necessarily look like much I won't name another place, but we need an ecological landscape to where we're part of it, nature is served, and it's growing again, and back to your point, Rob, that nature, we have to see ourselves as an actor in this landscape a different way, and New Orleans is this island where we can explore that. It has room for a lot more people. It will find ways to divide itself one against another because it's human nature. But it doesn't have very long to get its act together. It can't reset to what it was, and a flood, the Dutch say, is a terrible thing to waste. We had one August 5th. Shame on us if we waste it.
Thank you guys for being here. Prosperity starts with action, right? And so we have those schematics of the landscape architecture were fantastic, and I don't think anybody would say, I don't want that around. You've mentioned that folks were nervous to go into that action, right? You don't want to be sued, this, that, and the other. Are there any incentives from your office in particular that will start this action, right? And then even down to the personal house getting those water gardens in their yards, or incentivizing new small businesses to start green roof initiatives, which could expand throughout the entire city, et cetera, et cetera. What are the incentives to actually put these things into action, I guess is my question.
It's a really great question, and it's something that we talk a lot about. I participate in a lot of conversations with other cities that are doing this work, and they all have a lot of incentives that they're able to use for this. Unfortunately, we, because of a number of regulatory challenges in the structure of the way that we do things, it's difficult for us to offer incentives. It's something that probably Nadine could talk to better than I could in terms of what we're allowed to do with public money. But what I can say is that mainly the way that we've done it so far is through regulatory requirements by requiring new developments to build green infrastructure. So in terms of incentives in that space, we don't really have any. We don't, first of all, don't have any funds to put towards it. And second of all, if we had taxpayer funds to put towards it, we couldn't put it towards that because of our regulatory limitations on that. But what we are able to do is to partner with organizations who can. And so, we partner with great organizations. The Urban Conservancy is one of them. There's WaterWise NOLA, Louisiana Waterworks. There's a number of these organizations that we partner with as much as we can to try to support their work through technical assistance, or whenever we do have opportunities that we can pay for, that we can pay them to do work for us, so that we can continue the work that they're doing and support that work. One of the things we are able to do, though, that we're moving forward with right now, we just put out an RFP this week for a $5 million project through the National Disaster Resilience Competition. Because that's HUD money, and it all depends on what pot of funds it comes from, it's a little more free in what we can do with it. And so that program is going to be targeting low and moderate income homeowners in the Gentilly neighborhood for, it's going to be called our Community Adaptation Program. And so we're looking to get at least 150 homes. We're hoping to do a lot more than that, though, and really retrofit these homes to be sort of models. And what we know is that, if so-and-so up the street gets it done on her house, then everyone on the street wants to get it done. And whether they qualify for the program or not, they're probably more likely to do it. What we also know is that when we go into communities and say we're going to build a park or whatever, where we're going to store water, people immediately say, what can I do? And so, I think that from my office's perspective, I think we did a poor job of anticipating that. And so we're trying to catch up and trying to provide resources. But again, we try our best to promote our partners in that and work with them in doing that. But there's definitely interest in the community to find ways to do it.
So let's just do one more, because we're heading towards 9 o'clock, and then anyone that wants to ask some questions as soon as we come to an end here.
Good evening, Grace Morris. I work with the Sierra Club. Thank you so much for this panel tonight. It's been very educational. One thing I would love to see a panel on water management, have tap water. I'm a strong advocate of strong public water systems, and my question revolves around privatization. And so I'm going to put you guys back on the spot. The data is in that privatization fails It's a system that is structured. Capitalism doesn't work in a private monopolized world because the pipes don't compete against other pipes. And you're always siphoning off part of your revenue stream to private shareholders. It's going outside of the system. It's not getting reinvested locally. It's not getting reinvested back into the system. And so it's a structure that's built to fail, especially when we talk about equity and democracy. Water is life. Water is a basic human right. It is foundational to our democracy to have equitable access to clean drinking water and functional water systems. And so, knowing all this, and I think Veolia is a particular interesting company to cite, given that this is the company responsible for the Flint water crisis. I could go into the numbers on how the sewage side versus the drinking water side in New Orleans is doing, because I think we want to see that revenue redirected into our drinking water and our drainage. And that's not a system, and we don't have that option right now. And then Entergy, I also think Entergy has failed us in many ways. And one of that, often these boil notices, that's not the sewage and water board's department's fault. It's because of the power system. So I'm just curious why the hesitation to address the threat of privatization.
Well, since I didn't say anything the last time, I'll say something this time on the privatization. I don't know. I think that I'm not necessarily a fan of privatizing things, but I'm not convinced that it is by itself the problem. I think that it's about arranging the incentives. And I mean, you mentioned Entergy, and I think the problem in the energy sector is that these companies have only one way to make money, which is to build more infrastructure the way that they have been, so that they can raise the rates and then bring that in, and that they're not, at least in the case down here, I'll venture, are not regulated very carefully or stringently, and so it comes back to an issue of government. And that our government, I think, is not holding certain sectors maybe as accountable as they should. But so I guess I'm just saying I'm just not sure that privatization is itself the problem. I think it's a problem with the relationship between government and the private sector. But that's not to say that that I think privatization is great, because I think it just depends.
Yeah,
that's a lawyer's answer.
I think it does. I think it does require a great deal of oversight. Martin Melosi is a historian, University of Houston, and he's written about San Jose, their experiment, long-standing experiment with privatized management, which seems to have gone relatively successful. But it's something that developed out of the late 19th, early 20th century. So it's a partnership that's existed and has been monitored for some time. In the 1990s, there was a great deal of interest in it throughout the United States. And in fact, Atlanta became a cautionary tale. United Water, which was a subsidiary of Suez, a competitor of Veolia, took on the city's water supply system. The contract was terminated after 3 years. They didn't anticipate the problems that they were going to face. They tried to shrink the workforce, and it turns out they were way in above their heads. But water corporatism is a social fact. It's happening all over the developing world, particularly because of states that can't afford the kind of infrastructure that's needed. That's not exactly the problem. Well, it may be the problem we're facing here.
That's like the energy.
And so the question is, if that scenario emerges, then what kind of arrangements will we create to make sure that we're getting our just desserts and, the fundamental services that we need? So I'm in a sense like Rob. I don't necessarily say it's something that should be off the table. It has to be carefully managed if we do go down that path. But I don't really see there being much of a stomach for it here in New Orleans.
I just wanted to say one thing, speak to something that Tyler said, which I think is really important. I think it's important that we all recognize that the work that this administration has done along these lines, taking the long view, sort of opening up this conversation, creating an entire, nexus of folks just to think about this is pretty rare. And it's the first time that I'm aware of that it's happened in this city. And all of that can go away in a heartbeat with the new administration. So I think it's really important just to think about, as we think about prioritizing things and the coming election and thinking about what candidates are saying to us, it not only takes sort of the political will and the desire to keep this conversation going and actually to accomplish things, it also takes a certain amount of knowledge and awareness of what the issues really are, and or the recognition that you don't have that knowledge, but it's out there and you need to bring it in. So I just wanted to sort of lay that on the table because I think this administration has started this conversation and it has never been started here before. And the kind of effort and work and resources that they put into it is pretty unusual. So just kind of a shout out for them.
Okay, folks, we're right close to 9 p.m. Why don't we thank our whole panel and our moderator, Eric Hardy.
It's really nice to be on the panel.